Thanks for checking in today. I have decided to make a video about the new patch that I have made for the Empress Zoia Euroburo. It is a breath-controlled synthesizer patch that acts as a chord rotator. And so what happens is you send a note into the synthesizer outputs that note and a fixed interval and a rotating third note that rotates along a sequence. The patch that I've made here is a subtractive synthesizer that I've built inside the Zoia, and it has 3 oscillators, and I've built a chord rotator that outputs one oscillator as your input note that I think of as the melody, a second oscillator as a fixed interval, the parallel interval, and then a third oscillator that rotates based on some sequencing that I've done. So what I'm going to do here is walk through what's in this patch and how it works. The first thing is I'm just going to demonstrate the subtractive synthesizer. And so what I have here on this page is the synth voice itself. And so we have 3 oscillators. Oscillator 1 is the melody oscillator. It's a saw wave with some pulse width modulation, and I'm controlling the pulse width with breath. Then second oscillator is the interval or parallel oscillator. It's just a sawtooth. And the third oscillator is the rotating oscillator, which is also a sawtooth. And then I have those going into an audio mixer. I also have a separate noise source. The noise filters here, and its output goes into the mixer. The overall output of the mixer is into this main filter. So that's what's going on here on this page. It's a very simple 3 oscillator voice. There's a VCA and a filter, but no envelope, because with breath control, I'm using the breath as the envelope for the voice. Okay, back to this first page, which is a control page. We have at the top some MIDI inputs. This is MIDI note in and MIDI gate from that note in. And then I have, this is my breath CC02 coming into the synth, which I'm using to open the voice's VCA, also a closed low pass filter. And then it's also attenuated but modulating the pulse width of oscillator 1. This is pitch bend. It's attenuated and being mixed in to all of the oscillator pitch. Down here I have toggle switches for the effects. I have chorus, delay, and reverb. And so before I go any further, I'm just going to demonstrate the sound of the subtractive synth with breath control without the chord rotator being used. Okay, and so that's with no effects at all. And I have chorus. Okay, and then we also have delay. And you can hear it's a ping pong delay. One last effect is the reverb. So yeah, the effects on this this thing sound so good. All right, so those are just toggles for that. And then I have a toggle here that's MIDI controlled for turning the chord rotator on and off. I'm going to turn all the effects off so I can demonstrate what's going on with the chord rotator, and you'll be able to hear it a little more cleanly. So the first thing that we have here is this rotating sequence. So this is just a sequencer, and you see here I have this B1, G1, F1, and D sharp 1. What's actually happening is I'm summing the output of this sequence with the output of the MIDI note in. So what that means is I'm down here in the lowest octaves of the Zoia. So the Zoia's lowest note is an A0. So if I put in B1, setting the interval to be an octave and a step above the input note. And then here, this is a G1, so that is a minor 7th above the input note. But basically what we're doing is measuring up intervals from A0. And so you can think of this as just the interval width. G doesn't really mean anything. It's more that it's a minor seventh up. I input a note, and every time I gate a note or change notes, the sequencer advances, and the input note is summed with the sequencer output and going into that rotating oscillator. So here's, if I play the same note 4 times in a row, you'll hear those intervals. So it's going to be, I'm going to play a C, and so you're going to hear an octave and a step above, you're going to hear a minor seventh above, you're going to hear a minor sixth above, and you're going to hear a tritone above. Before I go into how it's advancing, because that's actually was a tricky bit of this, I want to talk about the other value that's coming out here, which this is the parallel interval. It works the exact same way. So this E1 is the E1 interval above an A0. So that's a fifth above, or 7 semitones above the input note. You can dial it in here and set it to whatever you want, and it'll just track according to the MIDI note. The first part of it was really easy. To detect the gate, all I had to do was connect the gate of the MIDI in to the gate of the step sequencer that advances each one. So the problem with that is if I play a note and then don't re-articulate but change notes, so a slur, then the gate just stays on and it doesn't advance the sequencer. So I had to also create something that would detect a pitch change. The way that I did that was on this page, I have a couple comparators with slew rate limiters going into triggers. The MIDI note coming in to the positive side of the comparator, and then a slewed version of the MIDI note coming into the negative side of the comparator. If you descend for a brief moment, the negative side is higher than the positive side, and it triggers the output. So the output hits the trigger hits the sequencer and advances it. If I ascend, then what I wanted to do was just switch those inputs around. So the slewed version goes to the positive input, the MIDI note goes into the negative input, and that means it'll detect whenever a note goes up. Then the last piece of this is these 4 toggle switches. And what they do is invert the step of the sequencer below them. So for this, instead of an octave and a major second up, it shifts that to an octave and a major second down. And what's actually happening is right here, I have a set of CV inverters, and I have the uninverted pitch going into this side of an in switch, the inverted pitch going into this side of an in switch, and then a toggle that switches us between channel 1 and 2. And then the output of those goes into this other sequencer. With all of those turned on, it moves that interval down below the input note, which I really like the sound of. It one more because I knew the next one would be a major chord if I did. Okay, so the only thing I didn't show you was this page, which is just the effects. We have a chorus here going into a ping pong delay, going into a hall reverb. So yeah, that's the patch. And if I turn all these effects back on, we can hear that rotator. So yeah, a very fun thing to play. So that's this patch. I've also made 2 other versions of this patch. The external instruments version is set up so that it will either control CV instruments. You could connect 3 external CV synths to it and control them. Or you could connect a single poly MIDI synth to it. Like I have an Ovation Peak that I control with it. and it'll work that way. That version doesn't have the synth voice. And because I didn't have to dedicate CPU to that synth voice, I was able to use that extra headroom I gained to add 2 more steps to the sequence and another interval. So I have 2 fixed intervals, one that I usually set a couple octaves up to reinforce the melody, and then I have a 6-step rotation instead of a 4-step rotation. And there's still plenty of room left in that patch. So that's the external version. Then I have a hybrid version that has 2 oscillators. The melody is coming from an external synth, so that I can have a really nice analog melody, and then the other 2 voices coming from the Zoia. So I have 3 versions of the patch. The rotator brain is really the same in all of them, except in the external only version. That rotator has an extra 2 steps and an extra interval in it. But all of the functionality of it works the same. The effects are in all of them, so that when you're using the external synths, the Zoia is processing the external sound. I've had the Zoia Euroburo for a couple weeks now. I'm blown away by what it can do. Other than this instrument itself, by far the most exciting piece of gear that I have ever gotten to mess with. It is just so cool. The only limitation is how much CPU it can handle. And I mean, in these patches, you can see I can, like in the hybrid patch, I can control an external synth, and I have an onboard synth, and I have this rotator brain, and I have the effects processing both the internal and the external, and a tiny little bit of extra room. And I'm using the CPU expensive version of the reverb. I could change the reverb to their reverb light. It's a mono reverb and doesn't have modulation in it. It's just a simple reverb. It does sound good. But if I switch to that, I would open up quite a bit of headroom in the CPU. So there's a lot of capability here. And I feel like I've only scratched the surface. I'll drop the links in the description. I hope you enjoy this. If there's anything you think I should try using the Zoia for breath control, let me know, because I'll really enjoy digging into it to see what I can make happen. I hope you enjoy it. See you in the next video.